Hello, everybody. Welcome back. I hope everybody managed to get a break and in proper conference fashion, have a very strong cup of coffee in a really small cup or go outside and get some fresh air. So we are now going into our final panel discussion and we're also going to have a Q&A before we wrap up today's conference. Before we get stuck into that, though, I wanted to give you the results from our poll that lots of people have taken part in next to the chat function. So thank you for doing that. So the question was, what do you think should be the next steps for financial services firms in reducing gambling harms? And we gave you 4 options, and we kind of really forced you to pick one of them. Whereas, I think a lot of people would say that we want lots of these things to be happening, but if you had to pick one, and the front runner, although it was close, was that 40% of people, or nearly 41% of people, said they would like firms to be using customer transaction data to help identify and support individuals, very closely followed by 39% of people saying they'd like firms to be prioritizing involving experts by experience in the development of safer gambling strategies, tools, and support. Those two were quite high above the other 2 options, which were exploring affordability checks and strengthening existing gambling blocks and tools, which is interesting because I think quite a lot of conversation focuses on strengthening existing gambling blocks and tools, perhaps because that's quite a lot easier than using customer transaction data to identify support. But it seems to be that the appetite is for doing those more difficult things. And actually, I'm pleased that those 2 things, so using lived experience insights and also using customer transaction data, can and should go together. So at this point, I'd point you to a report that we did at Money and Mental Health a couple of years ago called Data Protecting, looking at the role of transaction data to help identify and support people who may be struggling. It wasn't focused exclusively on gambling, although I do think gambling is probably the clearest use case for it, but where we explored the moral, ethical, policy, regulatory barriers to doing some of these things, but also some core principles about how you should use lived experience insight in order to do that in a way that feels empowering, useful, and meaningful for people, rather than like an experience that people would feel is intrusive. So please do have a look at that report. It is linked to in the main conference program and also in the chat function on the event chat. But yeah, encouraging to hear that people want those more ambitious kind of routes to be followed. So speaking of ambitious things that we can do, our final panel is looking at the approaches to the blurring of gambling and other activities like crypto, gaming, and investing. And we have a wide range of speakers today, and I'm really looking forward to getting all of their insights on this topic, how the financial services sector, regulators, and policymakers can all help. Over the last decade, we have seen very significant technological changes, which have created a myriad of new ways in which people can gamble or take part in activity that we don't actually class as gambling, but that shares many of the same characteristics or that plays upon some of the same behavioral insights or kind of vulnerabilities that we all have as, fallible human beings to make us take part in behavior that may not be in our own best interests. We've also seen other online activities becoming increasingly commonplace that blur those lines between leisure and financial investments or gambling. So cryptocurrencies, esports, and these were all brought into focus, particularly with the collapse of Football Index earlier this year, which raised some fairly urgent questions about how we define what is gambling and what is not, and what the response from regulators and government should be. So we're going to explore some of these slightly ambiguous boundaries, and we're going to explore what can best be done to help protect people from harm when, as an individual consumer, the definition of what is gambling is perhaps not as important as how much we're experiencing harm from the activities we're taking part in. So kicking off, so I'm going to introduce each of our speakers in turn. Everybody's going to contribute for just kind of 3 to 5 minutes, relatively short contributions to start with, so that we have time to come for questions and a discussion at the end. So kicking us off is Tim Miller from the Gambling Commission. Tim is Executive Director, National Strategy for Reducing Gambling Harms. He's responsible for research and statistics, policy development, and the national strategy, and has been at the Gambling Commission since 2016, building on over 15 years of experience across the regulatory and public sector. Tim, over to you. Thank you for coming today.
Great, thanks, Helen. I'm really delighted to be speaking at this event today and really pleased to see such a wide range of people and organisations represented here, because certainly one of the key aspects of the National Strategy for Reducing Gambling Harms that we published a couple of years ago was this idea of collaboration between regulators, between companies, but also importantly, collaboration across different sectors. And we recognised fairly early on that there's a really important role to play in trying to bring together kind of the gambling sector and the financial services sector. And I'm really delighted that over the last couple of years, I genuinely think that financial services companies have really stepped up to that challenge and taken it seriously, and so many fantastic innovations that we've seen. So I'm delighted that this conference is building on that today. And one of the reasons why that collaboration is so important is, as Helen's already touched upon, the lines between what is and is not gambling, particularly from the consumer's perspective, are much less clear than perhaps they ever have been. And we're really seeing that emerging in a couple of key areas. The first is that the line between what is gambling and what is playing on computer games is increasingly blurred, and that's a development that particularly puts children and young people at risk. We have some products out there that are free to play but have all of the same mechanics as many gambling products. They're not classed as gambling because they're free to play, but potentially create the risk of showing children and other young people how to gamble, but in an environment where none of the normal risks of gambling exist, and perhaps giving them a false sense of those risks. Similarly, and particularly relevant for today, we're seeing the increasing blurring of the lines between what's gambling and what's financial services, again, from that consumer perspective. That whilst legislation may try to define what's gambling, what's regulated financial services, the consumer's real experience of those products sometimes doesn't neatly fit into those statutory definitions. So we've seen, for example, the increasing use of the kind of language of investment being used around products that may well be gambling, or certainly that come very close to gambling. And I think it's really important that that's something that together we focus upon, because from the consumer's perspective, it's becoming increasingly difficult for them to understand exactly what type of product they are dealing with. I think that confusion becomes increasingly challenging when you start to bring in other new developments, the interjection of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, increasingly the use of non-fungible tokens, again, starts to create greater confusion as to exactly what type of product the consumer is getting involved with, and therefore creates greater risks as well. From our perspective as a regulator, our focus in this space over the coming months, the coming years, will be to continue to kind of patrol the border of what is and is not gambling, to identify those products that perhaps step over that line. And a good example of that from a couple of years ago was that we were the first regulator in the world to bring a prosecution where people were using computer games to facilitate gambling. In that case, people were piggybacking on the FIFA football game to allow facilities for illegal gambling, which was promoted to children, and we were successful in that prosecution. Over the coming months, the government will be reviewing our legislation, the Gambling Act, and particularly looking at other additional powers perhaps that we might need to address some of these issues. But what we're really clear on is that simply moving the boundaries, simply changing the definition of what's gambling to try and capture some of these things will not solve the problem. That as you move that perimeter, the skirmishes move with it. So I think it's really important for all of us today to focus on the consumer's experience and the information that we can give to consumers to help them understand exactly what types of products they're getting involved with and the sort of risks attached to them. What sort of risk factors should they be looking for? What sort of risk factors potentially could we find in some of the data and information that we've got? And importantly, I think we can all work together to provide consumers with much better information, to be really clear as to what products and services are regulated, what those protections are, and what types of products and services won't have any protections or the safety net of regulation. And I think if we can do that messaging in a joined up way, we will help consumers better understand some of the risks and build on the collaboration that we've already had so far.
Thank you, Tim. Very much appreciated. I think you raise a very good point there, that we could every year redraw the boundary around what is gambling, but are we going to be playing catch up forever? How do we get ahead of that debate? I'm now going to come to Matt Burgiss. So Matt Burgess is project manager at TalkBanStop and education and training lead in the Southeast for GamCare, and also expert by experience. Matt works as an education and training lead at GamCare, and that's a collaborative partnership, between Gamban and GamStop, which we've already heard quite a bit about today. Before working in that field, Matt was a professional actor touring the UK with different musical shows, and Matt's passion for helping those who are experiencing gambling-related harm comes from his own struggles with gambling, which occurred between 2010 and 2016. And we're very grateful Matt's going to share some personal experiences of gambling issues, as well as some insights from his professional work working with young people at GamCare. Thank you, Matt.
Cool. Thank you very much for having me. Really appreciate being here. As you said in that introduction, I work for GamCare. I work on the youth program. I'm also a project manager for TalkBanStop, and I have lived experience of a gambling issue myself. So my kind of gambling experiences are what you might class as the classic kind of gambling experiences, i.e. playing games like blackjack, roulette, and betting on sports. They were the things for me that became really problematic over a 6-year period. Now, my experience, unfortunately, did lead to a very, very serious suicide attempt, which, I later learned that, is something that happens to a lot of people in that kind of position. I think the thing I really want to touch on this panel with, kind of gaming and gambling and that relationship is actually, I'm someone that works, in the kind of sector. I have a very, very good knowledge now because of the work that I've done at GamCare around these issues. And even I sometimes struggle to understand the risks of some of these games that are kind of out there that are very much linked to gambling. And I think that's a really, really important issue to raise. It was only a couple of weeks ago I actually downloaded a game on my phone because I was bored on a train, and I opened that game up, and it was a very, very simple kind of game, but there was an option to put your own money in and play against other people, and then the winner would take a kind of jackpot, if you like. So it really got me thinking about like just how difficult it is, especially for young people. Like I said, I'm someone with that knowledge, and I could very quickly notice that was basically gambling. But for a young 14, 15, 16-year-old, they may not be able to do that. And that can become very, very dangerous. For me, the kind of conversation around what is gambling somewhat doesn't matter. For me, it's really about that emotional process. And I always talk about the emotional process of gambling. I know that when I was gambling, I experienced a huge amount of anticipation, adrenaline, and that kind of buzz that gamblers talk about. And if any type of game, any type of trading is giving me that same experience, that same emotional process, then to me, in my head, it's dangerous. Okay, but in terms of personally for me to do it, it would be dangerous. So I really think that awareness raising, for adults as well, but especially for young people, is so, so important. And that's why I'm really glad that I'm able to work on the youth project here at GamCare, because we are directly speaking to young people. We're directly speaking to the professionals that work with them. And I would really like to see organisations, whether that's financial institutions or these kind of trading organisations themselves, start to raise that awareness about potentially how volatile these products can be. And we've started to do that with our content at GamCare. Obviously we talk about gambling, but we do also talk about loot boxes. We're starting to talk a little bit more about cryptocurrency and day trading, just so young people have a kind of good baseline understanding of, it's not always going to be dangerous, but it can potentially be dangerous. And crucially, if it does become dangerous and something that is causing them problems in life, where they can go for that, to access that support and help and treatment. We're working really, really closely with young people. We've actually put a youth advisory board together, and we're trying to involve them in the processes of, building our content. We want them to help us co-create that content, because we want to make sure that what we're talking about is current, and digestible in a way that young people can understand. And then we also have our gambling related financial harm workshops as well. So these are bringing lots of different stakeholders together within the sector to really look at some key emerging issues, trying to tackle those issues kind of head on. And there are some summary reports that can be accessed. So my colleague Raminta is on this conference, and I'm sure she's going to put her email in the chat. If anyone wants to have a look at those summary notes, there are some kind of recommendations in there as well. We really feel like this kind of collaborative working is going to help us understand these issues first and foremost, but also then raise awareness about how people can stay safe, because that's the really key thing here, is staying safe. Someone earlier said, another expert by experience said that, once you've had a gambling issue, you're kind of susceptible to it for the rest of your life. And I very much feel like that. As the landscape changes, I have to be really, really aware of what's going on around me to make sure that I'm not participating in something that is a very similar emotional process to gambling.
Thank you, Matt. That's extremely helpful. And I kind of share your concerns about how hard it is to just understand the landscape and understand what might be harmful. I think as somebody who's not a parent of an 11-year-old, when we started working in some of this area, I did find myself on Google looking up what are some of these things and trying to understand the landscape a little bit more, and how we can expect to be able to have those conversations with young people and help them to understand and navigate it if we don't, is I think a real risk and a challenge for us all. I'm going to come now to Dr. James Close. So Dr. James Close is an associate lecturer at the School of Psychology in the University of Plymouth. James is a senior research fellow there, and his research has explored the convergence between gambling and gaming, with a specific focus on loot boxes, and was commissioned by GambleAware in 2020 and in collaboration with the University of Wolverhampton to investigate the psychological profiles of young people and adults who buy loot boxes and any links with potential harm. This was commissioned with the aim of improving future UK policy on loot boxes, feeding into the review of the Gambling Act. So absolutely perfectly timed. So over to you, James.
Thanks, Helen. That was a great introduction. I think summed up my work very well over the last couple of years. And I think before actually delving a bit more in depth, I think it's worth exploring with the audience what a loot box actually is, because I think some people might be a little bit naive about that, particularly if they've come from a gambling background. So a couple of forms a loot box might take in a video game would be, for example, Counter-Strike Global Offensive, where you get these crates, these weapon crates that are sometimes dropped in the game. You don't know what's inside, but you know there's going to be a gun in there. It might be a very, very cool gun, like a gold-plated Magnum or something, and it might be completely rubbish, beaten up old Glock. And obviously, you want that good gun. It's worth pointing out, actually, that gun, if you've got a good one in there, it's only purely in that game. It's purely cosmetic. It's not functional in any way. It doesn't help you get the game. But to unlock the crate, to find out what's inside, you have to purchase a key. That's going to be £1.49 to unlock it and find out what you've got. So it's very sort of gambling-like mechanics. You're paying to get something which, if you're a teenage boy, it might be very, very cool. A similar one might be in FIFA, where you have these player packs, and within those player packs, you may be able to open and get, Ronaldo, someone very cool, or Lionel Messi. And actually, in this game, that if you can unpack that player, that will give you a very good functional advantage in the game. You'll be able to compete much better with your friends with that. But they also come in games in other various guises, like Pokemon Go, for example, also has very similar mechanics of these items, these eggs that you unhatch, and which are sort of time delayed crate and key mechanic, very similar to Counter-Strike Go in many ways. So they come up in these quite hidden places. And obviously they've come under quite a lot of scrutiny because they have very strong psychological and structural characteristics with gambling. The reason they're not classified as gambling is because they don't often transgress that money's worth legal definition of gambling. That these are purely digital assets. They don't have money's worth. Having said that, it's quite easy to take a lot of these items and buy and sell them on secondary, black market illicit marketplaces, but also on primary marketplaces itself, such as Steam, which provides a lot of PC gaming. That's where most PC games are bought and sold. You can go on the Steam marketplace and buy and sell these things very easily in a market of tens of thousands of people, a very large, essentially financial marketplace. So there are primary markets, and a lot of the secondary markets are enabled by the providers. So the providers are often hiding behind their own terms and conditions, which say these things don't have money's worth, but actually technically they do, and they can be bought and sold very easily. So our work essentially has involved a large package of research into loot boxes. We've done structured literature reviews, systematic reviews. We've done meta-analysis on people's existing work. We've also done a large set of interviews with a cohort of gamers from right across the UK, which some of that work reiterates what Matt was just talking about. People do buy these products often for quite gambling-like motives. So, they will buy them in impulsive and compulsive reasons, along with a whole host of other sort of gameplay-related reasons as well. We've also done a very large survey of gamers from across the UK, the largest survey of its kind. And essentially, all this different work is pointing to various things. I think the main take-home messages are that this link with loot box engagement and problem gambling, which has been well covered in the media, is very, very strong and robust, i.e. those people who engage with loot boxes are more likely to be problem gamblers, particularly at that high-end spectrum. So that high-end spending spectrum, those people spending hundreds, sometimes thousands of pounds a month on them are much more likely to be problem gambler. And that actually makes up a substantial portion of industry profits from these things. Similarly, problem video gamers are much more likely to spend large amounts of money on these products. And we also have some work under review at the moment showing links with various socio-demographic factors. So males, young people are more likely to spend money on them, but also those with lower educational attainment, those with lower levels of employment, and people with lower income spend a higher proportion of their income on loot boxes. So essentially, all this evidence, I think, is pointing to the fact that policy action on loot boxes and similar products does have very strong evidence that it has utility for harm minimization. And I think we'll get into that discussion of what that policy might look like a little bit more in through this discussion. But I think reiterating what others have said, I think it starts with education. I think it's such a fast evolving place and so complex, and overlaps so much with things like social media, what's going on there, and gambling and gaming, all these psychological nudges that push people into buying certain products that they may have not started out meaning to do. I think it starts with education about those different psychological techniques that are used, things like variable reinforcement ratios, anchoring, endowment effects, and getting people invested into products. And I think that education can start very young, from the PHSE education, for example. Having said that, I think you do need multi-stakeholder buy-in. We do need financial services. We do need the gaming companies as well to get involved, because as we've seen from the gambling sphere and things like smoking and alcohol, until you've got that multi-stakeholder approach, it's really hard to get traction on reducing harms.
Thank you very much, James. That's absolutely fascinating. I'm going to come to Sharon now, but I'm sure we will pick back up on some of those points that you've raised in the discussion. Sharon Collard is Professor of Personal Finance, is Professor of Personal Finance and Research Director at the University of Bristol's Personal Finance Research Centre, PFRC. So much of Sharon's work explores the intersections between low income, vulnerability and personal finance. And alongside developing PFRC's recent guide for financial services firms on gambling, vulnerability and FCA compliance, Sharon has explored the links between risky investing and gambling problems. So over to you, Sharon.
Thanks very much, Helen, and MMHPI for inviting me today, and it's great to be here. So, as Helen said, I'm just going to have a bit of a think about the links between risky investing and harmful gambling, which kind of follows on very nicely from what James was saying about the links with loot boxes and gaming. And so what we know from the academic studies that have been carried out, and quite a lot of that work has been carried out since about 2017, is that risky trading and investing can be part of a much broader repertoire of gambling activities for people. And what the studies show is that it can be a really toxic combination for people. So some of the key findings from those different studies are around there being clear links between higher rates of harmful gambling and high frequency trading and investing, and particularly high frequency trading and investing in riskier products. So what does that mean in practice? Well, it's things like trading every day or multiple times a day, things like derivatives, foreign exchange, cryptocurrencies, which Helen mentioned earlier, and kind of getting sucked in to something that becomes all consuming in a way that gambling can for people who experience harm from it. And linked to that, of course, addictive like trading and investing behaviour. So what the studies show are things like people experiencing small early wins followed by chasing losses, which means that they can end up losing control over the money they've invested quite quickly, and indeed losing the money that they've invested, not just losing control over it. The other thing I just Matt mentioned about mechanics, and James also mentioned kind of architecture. So, you know, these things don't happen by chance. The speed and fluidity of the investment interface is, I think, very similar to gambling apps. So it's encouraging people to make quick, instinctive decisions. And I've heard recently a talk by Gary Stevenson of Gary's Economics, and he pointed out, you know, there are certain patterns on investment apps that are very similar to gambling sites and apps. So things like heavy use of chart watching, you're looking at charts that seem to tell you, giving you information about what's happening. So, you know, really being focused on that. And also things like focusing on tips that come through from sites, investment sites, thinking, you know, posts about intuition, things from gurus and social influencers, which all kind of make up for this kind of quite exciting and kind of high intensity experience. And again, that kind of, I think, speaks to what James was saying, Matt was saying earlier about the emotional nature of it. I think the risks that there are between risky investing and harmful gambling have been exacerbated during the pandemic as well. When we've been spending much more time at home, we might be feeling isolated and bored. And we certainly know that human emotion can drive financial decision making in times of uncertainty and volatility, which we are certainly in now. I think the promotion on social media emphasises things like big profits and rapid growths from new types of investment like day trading, cryptocurrency. And it's kind of sold as a fast track to wealth, or for people who are gambling harmfully, a way to make money to continue gambling. And I think the other thing about it is that it may initially seem like quite a social thing. You're part of a community. You might feel somewhat maverick. You know, it's feeling that you're doing something that's different to what other people are doing. It's not the same boring investment in an ISA that other people are doing. You're doing something new and exciting. And I think that also brings us to the conundrum around kind of how you protect people and how you regulate this space. Others have talked about that. You've talked already about the blurred line. I think a key question for me is around regulating that online space where so much of this is happening. So we've got social influencers giving unregulated financial advice. We've got a lot of this activity happening, and also the real risk of people being defrauded and scammed online. So yeah, I'll leave it there, but I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sharon. So much there that I think we want to pick up in the discussion. So I'm going to come to our final speaker, who is our own Conor Darcy, who's the head of policy and research at Money and Mental Health. Prior to joining the organisation, Conor worked for the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, the Resolution Foundation and the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. He studied at the LSE and at Trinity College in Dublin, and Conor's team have explored the links between gambling and mental health problems over recent years, with a particular focus on the role of the financial services sector to support those who are most at risk. Conor, over to you.
Thanks very much, Helen. So I am going to talk a little bit about some surveys that we've done with our research community, digging into particularly these kinds of products or games and other non-gambling gambling, as we're catchily calling it. I think the reason that we're so interested in this is because we know a lot of the the triggers, and some of which have already been touched on, but how many common symptoms of mental health problems can increase your risk of falling victim and losing some serious sums of money to these sorts of products. And I think we know that, say, often people are struggling financially in the first place. We know that people with mental health problems are likely to have significantly lower incomes than the rest of the population. Another really common symptom is impulsivity, and just makes it much harder to resist something that might seem attractive, which I think we heard specifically with relation to gambling, makes it much harder to resist advertising when you do get that bit of information there. And when we've asked people around ads for these sorts of products, for cryptocurrencies and for day trading, advertising again is something that comes up as something that people are seeing regularly. So again, the same kind of pathways into it. Similarly, decision making can be affected, so that you just, where you might see something that's high risk and potentially could end up costing you quite a bit, making that decision and deciding actually this isn't the right option for me at this moment is just that much harder to do when your mental health isn't great. And then finally, asking for help when you are experiencing difficulties with this can just be so much harder, where we know across a whole range of mental health problems and issues, that when your mental health isn't great, it is just so much harder to reach out and ask for that help when it is available. So we dug into this a bit, these questions on these specific products, not in as much detail as, for instance, that James and others have done. But I think we found some really interesting insights. I think we found actually that there was less overlap between gambling and some of these use of some of these products, where a minority actually gambled regularly. So I think it raises some interesting questions over how exactly support to this is targeted, and how people kind of think of themselves and the activities that they're doing, which is maybe one interesting question for firms and banks to ponder. But I think when we asked people about the impact that it had on them and how their mental health led them into the gambling, not the gambling, but the use of these products, the stories were very, very similar to gambling, where people talked about chasing a high, the need to try and earn a bit more money if they were financially in a bad place, and being seen as a quick win sometimes. And that was really across a whole range of issues. I think on loot boxes, we heard one really interesting aspect that gets specifically into the mental health problem issue, where often people tell us that when your mental health is poor, you lack control over so much of your life, of your own health, but also whether or not you have income coming in, whether or not you can solve problems that are cropping up. So one person told us that feeling in control and being able to move on in the game, even if you can't do it in reality, is just so powerful, and is again a really hard kind of cycle to break if you are buying loot boxes and getting that kind of gratification when it goes in those directions. But when we ask people around products like foreign exchange trading or day trading, people told us a lot of the same things that we hear about gambling, where people feel like they're on a lucky streak, and when they're in a bipolar, a manic phase, it can just mean that they spend thousands very quickly. When they're feeling low and their emotions are in a bad place, that actually buying or betting more can help them to feel better and in a happier place. And then again, the kind of insecurity financially just leads people on to more rash decisions. As one person who was doing spread betting told us, that at such times it's not possible to think rationally, although at the time that I believe that I am. So I think education and information around this, to make sure that people are aware of the risks, is really important. But I think it's also important to move beyond that and think about, well, when people's mental health isn't great, what are the other options to kind of slow down some of the potential harm that can crop up. And then just to come on to crypto lastly, we heard a lot of the same things, where people spent more, thought it was a get-rich-quick scheme. The added element here was around scams, where people were, a couple of people told us that they had invested in what they thought was crypto, and it turned out not to be. It was something where they just lost money. And again, I think this all ties into the sense of shame and guilt, and that often crops up and makes it much harder to disclose that you are experiencing a difficulty. So if that's, again, that doubling impact of not wanting to share your mental health problem, but also not wanting to share that you've made what you see as a bad financial mistake, it can just make it that much harder to come forward and ask for support. So I think that's why it's so important that banks think about everything that they can do in the round to support customers in that sort of position, to make it easier to disclose, to think about how they use data, think about the training that's offered to staff. So there's a whole range of options that hopefully we'll get into those in a bit more detail in the discussion.
Thank you very much, Conor. That was really, really useful. So if people would like to submit questions for our speakers, you can put them straight into the event chat. I'd encourage you to use your name if you're happy to do that, though you can post anonymously. And if there is somebody specific that you'd like me to target the question at, please suggest that as well. So we've had a few questions already coming in, and I also have a few prepared as kind of chair's privilege. I'm going to send a few of those to you first while people are submitting their questions. James, I was going to come to you on this first, but then I might open it up to the whole panel, actually, which was, so we know that the government's reviewing evidence on loot boxes, and under the context of the Gambling Act review, I would hope that they are also considering the links with other forms of risky behaviour that we've talked about now. But whilst that is ongoing, is there anything that we would like to see financial services firms doing now? So the process of reviewing the Gambling Act legislation is not going to be something that's wrapped up within the next 6 months. How can we get ahead of that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the financial services should potentially be working with the gaming companies quite closely. And I think actually the gaming companies are probably the best place to act as gatekeepers here about what's going on. I think you have a few providers actually, propping up a lot of the industry. Your Google Store, your Apple Store, Steam for the online marketplace, and then PS4 and Xbox and so forth. So there are a minor amount of very large gaming companies that are providing a lot of content here, and I think it's up to them to work with financial services to label games with that content and act as gatekeepers to allow access to it. And I think they've turned, you might say turned a blind eye. I don't think that's necessarily quite the right phrase, but I think they've been quite head in the sand potentially about the dangers of loot boxes and some of the products they're selling and the risks that might be harm associated with them. I think now the evidence is very strong and strongly accrued by various groups over the last 2 or 3 years. I think that they can't ignore that anymore, and I would hope we're working more strongly with financial services providers to try and act as gatekeepers to limit, particularly, there's a question by Karen Fowler already here about labeling apps with what's inside them, and I think this needs to happen with loot boxes. I think there needs to be much better game labeling and age limits, spending limits, clear demarcation of currency as well. I don't think they should be using in-game currencies. I think that's an obfuscation of cost, which is very difficult for me as a researcher in the field sometimes to work out how much something actually costs. So how we expect children to do that, I don't know. I think that there needs to be that buy-in from the different stakeholders to make sure these things are actually labelled much more clearly, and also that there's the gatekeeper obligations from everyone to make sure products are bought by people who should be buying them.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to come in with any suggestions on what, because a lot of the attendees who are watching today are from financial services firms, what we would like them to be taking away and probably acting on in the shorter term?
If I can come in, if that's
there.
right.
Sorry.
That's all right. I'll go Sharon, then Tim.
Sorry, Tim. I was just going to, just a point on labelling, actually, because chatting to a financial services firm recently, and one of the issues that they flagged was not being able to identify necessarily the transactions, loot box transactions, on how can you see what's being spent? Because that's that may not be clear on a bank statement or an online statement. So I think that's one practical thing where James was talking about financial services and gaming companies working together. How are those transactions seen by both parents, gamers, and by financial services, particularly given the strong support for the use of transaction data.
Tim, over to you.
Yeah, so just drawing upon, I've had sort of over the years lots of conversations, particularly with parents whose children have been able to spend a lot of money on in-game items, whether that's through the App Store or through other games. And I think one of the things they were struck by, one was how quickly huge amounts of money could be spent on those in-game items without it perhaps hitting any triggers with their bank as it looking an unusual set of transactions. So I think there's certainly something there in terms of the data that financial services companies have access to. I think the other thing, and I say this as a parent of a teenager, and that there's nothing better than having a teenager to make you feel really old. But increasingly, as we all get older, I think we find this technology harder to understand ourselves sometimes. A number of the parents that I've spoken to said that they'd kind of allowed their payment card to be used for some of these in-game items. They put in the details once, thinking that once they'd done that transaction, that would be it, and not realizing that actually those payment details were kind of still left open, and their children were able to carry on spending without their knowledge. And that comes down to kind of a lack of understanding from the parent. And as I say, having a teenager myself, I absolutely get that, because I'm baffled by some of the stuff that she does sometimes. But I think again, it's that is there more that the banks can do to actually help their customers understand where some of those risks come from, that if you do put in your details into some of these kind of game sites, that they can be kept open for a period of time, and what they can do to try and prevent that from happening.
Thank you, Tim. Does anybody else want to come in on those kind of suggestions about what firms could do?
Just adding to those comments, I do fear that sometimes the emphasis is put on the consumer in these issues, that they maybe should have known better, and actually I think that there is this consumer protection issue here, that there should be sort of default spending limits, and cards shouldn't be remembered, particularly in kids games, by default, and able to accrue large amounts of money. And we see large amounts of these products that and actually this is one survey that hasn't been done, which should have been done, is the amount of parents across the country who have been sort of hoodwinked by these default mechanisms and ended up having large amounts of money spent on their cards. And actually I don't think that these big providers should be making content like that available. I think we could have very clear sign-up mechanisms for distributors who are making their content available, that these default mechanisms aren't in place at that point of sale, in a way, and the emphasis should be back on the provider to make sure these things aren't going to happen, rather than the consumer themselves.
I think that's an important point, James. And I suppose building on that, I'd be interested to know, particularly maybe from Sharon or Conor, do we think there is A, the appetite, or B, the kind of technical capability for consumers to be able to self-exclude themselves from other forms of risky financial products or other kinds of spending behaviours? So we've talked a lot about gambling and the gambling merchant category code. Could people be given the option to exclude themselves from in-app spending, and could people be given the option to exclude themselves from risky trading or investments, or do the mechanisms not exist at the moment to be able to do that? Sharon, I don't know if your research has touched on the kind of technical capability to do that.
I think that's a really interesting question, Helen. And also, we've talked about bank card blockers as payment services develop and it becomes much more peer-to-peer. I think that's also an issue. But I was just thinking, I'm not sure if there's anybody from Gamban on the conference, but I'm fairly sure that Gamban has now extended its product so that it includes exclusion from risky investment sites. So those platforms, if somebody uses Gamban, then they wouldn't be able to access risky investment sites either, which I think is really helpful. But I think there are still questions about what's visible, what can be seen, and therefore what can be effectively blocked.
Thank you. And Conor, is this something that came up from the research community? Is there an appetite for those kinds of controls?
Yeah, I think there definitely is. Some of what we heard was that actually, for all the difficulties and problems with gambling operators that we've heard already today, that there is, some information and there are tools available on there if you can find them to kind of slow you down or add some friction or add some limits. Whereas often with these sorts of websites, there just weren't any what people call firewalls or any other ways to stop themselves from being very easily able to spend thousands in seconds. So I think from the people that we heard from, there's definitely a demand for this. And I think it probably goes into some broader things as well that we know around friction, but also around how the design of websites and how things look are just so hard to kind of tackle, and how when your mental health isn't great. So I think giving people the tools to prevent themselves before they get into that cycle, and to avoid spending too much on these sorts of activities is really important.
So I think we've identified maybe 3 different levels where we sort of need some action to happen. We've got the kind of individual information and support, both for people who might be taking part in risky financial behaviours or in-game trading or buying loot boxes and things, and also parents of young people. We have something around controls and tools to help people limit their own behavior, whether that is from financial services firms, or whether it's about labeling of games and apps and other behavior. But then we also have this regulatory level of responsibility that we haven't really touched in on too much depth. So Tim, if it's all right, I'm going to come to you on that one. Given these blurry boundaries and the kind of very insightful remark you made at the beginning about the fact that the answer is not necessarily just to keep redrawing the boundaries, what is the solution from a regulatory perspective? Is it about collaboration, and how in practice do we make that work?
Yeah, so I think there's a number of things. I mean, as I touched on earlier, one is ensuring that as individual regulators, we are kind of patrolling those boundaries, so that where you do have products that, are unlicensed, but step over that statutory boundary as to what is gambling, that we take action. And, I gave that example earlier, the Foot Galaxy case, where we were the first gambling regulator in the world to bring a prosecution for that, and colleagues around the world kind of took notice of that. I think similarly, it becomes even more important that individual regulators then increasingly work together and collaborate with each other. And I think in this space, there's, for me, 3 really key regulators, which is us, Financial Conduct Authority, and the Advertising Standards Authority. We are increasingly looking to work together much more effectively. Just in the last kind of month or two, the Gambling Commission and the Financial Conduct Authority have signed a new memorandum of understanding that seeks to strengthen the way that we work together, seeks to strengthen the way that we share information, and allows us to better kind of escalate issues that might be pushing at those boundaries a bit. And then I think the third area, and again, something I touched on earlier, is making sure that as regulators, we better share information with consumers in a accessible way, in a user-friendly way, that helps consumers to understand what products are regulated, what those protections might mean, and importantly, helps them to better understand the types of products and services that won't have any regulatory protections, so that they can form perhaps a better understanding of the sort of risks that might appear.
Thank you, Tim. I'd be interested to know what other panelists think about that as well. So I suppose 2 bits there. One is, what would you like to see regulators doing? And the second is, do we think it's realistic to expect consumers to think about what is regulated and what isn't regulated and make decisions? Or is that the role of something else? Certainly from the research that I've seen, I think an understanding of even what regulation is would be quite a big first step in some markets. Does anybody have any thoughts they'd want to add to the pot on that one?
I just wanted to hop in from a financial services perspective, because I think for any financial services, regulated financial services, trying to work out what's regulated and not regulated in terms of products and activities is not straightforward. And so there is the FCA's register, which you can check, but that doesn't. There isn't a definitive answer very often about what's regulated and what's not, because it's so complicated. So I think expecting consumers to understand that is optimistic. And the second thing I would say is that from the FCA's own research, it is very interesting qualitative research with people, young people mainly, who bought cryptocurrencies. They weren't interested in whether it was FCA protected or not, because that to them was a mark of it. The fact that it wasn't regulated would be something that they were interested in, not that it was regulated. So I think it comes back to the conversation that we had about kind of emotion, mindset, psychology behind using some of these things. and actually regulators being in tune with that mindset, which might be quite different to kind of what they're used to expecting from consumers.
Thank you,
I'd say
Sharon.
one narrow bit of regulation where there are some opportunities is around advertising, where so many people that we spoke to heard about this through online ads or real world ads, where often the risks weren't very clearly advertised, and I think more crackdown on those where they're really overstating the gains and understating the risk is another good route.
Thank you, Conor. I'm going to come to Matt just very quickly for a contribution on this, because I don't think we've come to you as much as we would have liked to so far, but specifically thinking about young people. So how do you think we can most effectively support young people to make informed decisions about these kinds of activities? Do you think there is a role for banks to send kind of communications and information to young people? Should it be schools? Is it about parents? What have you learnt at GamBan so far on this?
Yeah, I think the phrase "informed decision" is a really, really important one. Okay, I know historically we know through drugs and alcohol that telling young people to not do something usually doesn't work, and that's very much the approach we take at GamCare on the youth program. We've got to treat young people with respect. We've got to treat them, in some cases they know more about these issues and these kind of products than we do as experts, if you like. So yeah, I think we need to be really clear in the, as someone said there, about messaging. When something is a product that can potentially be dangerous, we need to make it clear to young people that what they're getting into, so they can make that decision. But again, I always go back to you're never going to save everyone, and at the very least, what we can do is signpost to those. We have a young person support service, signposting to those services so they know that if they do get into any kind of trouble, where to go for that help. And obviously, the earlier that we can access those young people that are experiencing problems, usually the better that kind of recovery is, and they don't experience as much harm.
Thank you, Matt. I'm afraid we are out of time for our final panel discussion of the day. So I'll just say a huge thank you to all of our speakers. We had some questions come in that I'm afraid we didn't get a chance to get to, but if you would like to keep in touch with any of the attendees, or you want to hear from people, feel free to pop email addresses in the chat, and we can always link you up if there are questions remaining unanswered. But thank you again for all of your insights, and particularly, Matt, for sharing your personal experiences as well, because it's a heavy ask on top of sharing your professional experiences. So thank you. We really, really appreciate it. So it just falls to me then to wrap up not only this panel, but our whole conference today, and to say an enormous thank you to everybody for giving so much of your time and insights into these discussions. We talked about at the beginning wanting to make it a meaningful use of time and wanting to go away with some really practical things that we could all do. And I feel like we absolutely have. I was trying to make notes of kind of top 3 sort of insights to draw together at the end, and I've got a list of about 10 because there were too many interesting things. But a few things that stood out to me. Firstly, at the very beginning, this just feels so timely. So the minister said right at the start of the day, we should expect the Gambling Act white paper within the next few months. I mean, that's a ministerial calendar, so those windows often shift, but I think it does focus the attention quite a lot on kind of the timing of this and how quickly we need to be trying to influence the government's agenda. This was also, today was the first time I've ever heard the phrase levelling up, referring to gambling controls, which was a very nice, I thought, attempt to hook this into the government's levelling up agenda. And if we can make levelling up mean another thing, then why not? I thought Charles Randall's point at the beginning was extremely powerful, that for anyone who missed it, Charles shared that his dad was a bookmaker on track at the races. And to think that we've moved so quickly from Charles's dad working on a track doing kind of betting there through to people being able to bet and gamble on their phone, on the bus, and using their parents' credit cards, we were just discussing in the most recent session, with very few limits and controls on things, because it has moved at such pace. It is quite amazing to think about the scale of harm. But also feels all the more important to have us all here committed to taking action on it. Some of the key issues that were raised earlier were around workarounds, and particularly overseas payment providers and overseas gambling companies being a kind of relatively straightforward workaround some of the gambling blocks. But I think one thing I took away from the discussion so far was the need to focus both on the relatively small and unambitious changes and get them right, at the same time as focusing on the long term and the bigger picture. So a really important point was raised about the value of friction. And we've talked about the gambling blocks, but we've also talked a little bit in some of the sessions about web design and about how we slow down people's decision making, make sure they can, as Matt just said, make informed decisions so that people can take part in the activities that are right for them in the way that's right for them. And it reminded me, we often talk about some of the most effective interventions in suicide prevention were putting paracetamol in pot packs rather than in tubs, and limiting the amount that you can buy in one go, as well as putting barriers on bridges. And in the context of this conversation, it's clear that that is friction. Neither of those things stop somebody completely from buying lots of paracetamol or climbing over a barrier, but the evidence suggests that slowing us down helps us to make informed decisions that are in our own best interests. So I think one thing I was taking away from today was the need to, as well as looking at this kind of bold horizon of how we're going to be using and sharing transaction data, how we're going to be able to reach out to people to anticipate problems and offer things like more comprehensive blocks that work across different systems, we also need to not underestimate the power of some of the simple things and making sure that we're fine-tuning them and getting them really right. There was a really powerful example raised by Michael, one of our lived experience speakers earlier, about difficulties sharing information about his gambling issues within one bank. So one part of the bank recognizing him as a more vulnerable customer and offering lots of support, while another part of the bank was aggressively collecting debts, and the two were not speaking to each other. So making sure that we're getting data sharing right within firms, as well as looking at how we do it between firms and between industries. So there are challenges here. There's a lot of levels that we need to act on, but I was really inspired by the level of insight that everybody brought to the discussions today, and also by the number of opportunities there are at the moment to make this change, not only by brilliant people in firms doing really exciting things. And I should say, it did make me smile, Riley, this morning, the minister saying that it was the government's roundtable that put down the gauntlet for financial services firms to do card blocks, when we know that some of you on this call were working on them a long time before that, and some of the researchers in the room have been exploring and calling for that for a very long time as well. So full credit to you for spurring that action on. But also some of the policy opportunities that are happening at the moment. The most recent discussion we just had reminded me how siloed some of this activity has become, where we look at the online safety bill that's looking at scams and is likely to touch upon some of the issues around crypto. But then we also have the government's work looking at the future of online advertising and the regulation of advertising that will touch on gambling advertising, crypto advertising. It will also look at the relationship between advertising and behaviour change. And then separately, we've got the Gambling Act review, and we separately again have the government, the Home Office review of fraud and the Fraud Action Plan. And then in another world, we also have work from the FCA looking at the design of online sites and how people interact with sales environments for credit. So I think it's really important that events like this keep happening, to keep cutting through those silos and reminding each of us who's working in one of those work streams of everything that's happening in all of the others, so that we can continue to learn from each other. A final thank you to say to everybody, as well as those who've come and participated, to say an enormous thank you from me to the team at Money and Mental Health for the hours of work, the love and labour that they have put into pulling this together today, particularly to Bronwyn, who has organised this whole event. We are enormously grateful, and I think everybody would agree that you've done a fantastic job. And also thank you to the team at SSTV who have facilitated it all. And very finally, there is a feedback survey that has been shared in the chat. We would really love to hear from you about what we could do better today and what we can do more of next time, and ways that you'd like to be more involved in the future. And then just finally, another plea from me, let's not let all of these ideas and enthusiasm be buried in a cloud of emails this afternoon. My encouragement to you would be to write down one thing that you're going to do as a result of this morning and take it away and remind yourself tomorrow so that we can all get on and do it. Or even better, tell us what that one thing is. You can contact us at contact@moneyandmentalhealth.org. We love to hear what you are up to. We love to hear more about how you're using research and insights, whether it's from ours, from Sharon, from James, from others on the conference today, to make a difference to people's lives, and also to discuss how we could work together to support you to do that in the future. So please do keep in touch with us. Thank you for coming and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.